wherever you'd like. It's working. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Pope St. John. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the faculty and the staff and the community here. It's great to have the alumni back. It's also great to have Father Perlardi, the former rector, joining us tonight. So I welcome him in a very special way. Bill? And tonight, it is a distinct honor as when he was being introduced on the plane with the Holy Father, I think it was the papal spokesman said, "Holy Father, this man needs no introduction." And he was referring to John Allen. It's a great honor for us to welcome John back to the Archdiocese of Boston, but particularly to welcome him to our seminary. John has taken the time out of his hectic schedule to be with us tonight and tomorrow, to share with us tonight some insights about Syria and about the situation in the Middle East, and then tomorrow to share some insights about the Vatican itself. We've been anticipating his visit. The insights that he will share with us tonight, I'm sure, will be amazing and very thought-provoking, and probably producing much prayer on our part for the brothers and sisters throughout the world, but particularly in the Middle East. So would you please join me in welcoming John Allen from the Crux.
Hello there, Boston. How is everyone tonight? Listen, I have been asked to speak to you tonight about the realities of anti-Christian persecution around the world, which are tragic and harrowing and command our most urgent attention. And I will get to that in a moment. But before I begin, as it happens, this is the first time I have been back to Boston since the news agency I run, which is called Crux, it is an online Catholic news outlet that covers the Catholic Church, separated from its parent company, which was the Boston Globe. Crux began life in 2014 as a project of the Globe under the ecclesiastical patronage of Cardinal Sean O'Malley. probably his second best decision after appointing you as rector of this seminary. And I have not had an opportunity to be back in Boston since then. So may I just, if you don't mind, use this opportunity to say one quick thing, which is, all of you, I know not everyone in this room is necessarily a Bostonian, but many of you are, and this is where we are. Let me just say this. As Catholics in the Boston area, you can feel extraordinarily good and extraordinarily proud about the way your local newspaper handled this transition. I wasn't happy about the decision that the Globe made to shut Crux down because it meant that for at least a couple of days I was out of a job. Thank God that didn't last particularly long. But every decision the Globe made after that point was as classy and as gracious as is humanly imaginable. They essentially gave us the rights to Crux so we could keep this project going at absolutely zero cost, a decision that no journalism corporation in the history of humanity has ever made. They allowed us to continue to sit on their servers for several months at no cost and continuing to give us access to their systems of support. Basically speaking, what the Boston Globe did is that they invested an enormous amount of resources in creating a new Catholic media outlet that was intended to be of service to the Church in the United States and around the world. And once they had developed it to a point where it could survive on its own, they handed us the keys to the kingdom at no charge and allowed us to determine our own future. And so what I want you in Boston to hear is that if you were feeling any disappointment that the Globe pulled the plug on this experiment in coverage of the Catholic Church, applying the best standards of journalistic tradecraft, if you're feeling any disappointment that they pulled the plug on that and backed out, don't. Because what they have allowed us to do is become independent and to chart our own course with their resources, their service, their support at our backs. That's something that no secular newspaper in the world has ever done for a Catholic news outlet. I feel an enormous debt of gratitude to the Boston Globe, and I hope as Bostonians you won't resent how the Globe handled this. You will in fact celebrate it because it was extraordinarily gracious on their part. So let me say, as the CEO of Crux Catholic Media Incorporated, to all of you in the Boston area, okay, I owe you and I will never be done saying thank you to you. My motto is, you can take Crux out of Boston, you will never take the Boston out of Crux. All right, now on to our subject tonight. Oddly, here's how I want to begin. The Pope walks into a bar with a frog on his shoulder. The bartender looks up and says, "Hey, that's kind of cool. Where did you get it?" And the frog says, "Buenos Aires." Now, I wanted to begin with at least one laugh line, ladies and gentlemen, because unfortunately our subject tonight is no laughing matter. This is not going to be evening at the Improv for the next 40 minutes, because what we are here to talk about is, in fact, in my opinion, the most dramatic Christian narrative of our time, the most dramatic Christian story of the early 21st century, and it is, at the same time, the transcendent human rights issue of our time. That is, an issue that requires absolutely no faith commitment to appreciate the magnitude of, and that is the reality of anti-Christian persecution in the early 21st century. So what I would like to perform for you tonight, if you like, is a symphony in 4 movements. I am first going to give you a couple of caveats whenever we talk about anti-Christian persecution. That is, preliminaries that will set the table for everything else we talk about. Secondly, I am going to give you a statistical overview of the realities of anti-Christian persecution in our time. Third, I will tell you a couple of stories designed to put faces and names in flesh and blood on the statistics that I will present. And finally, I will give you a couple of thoughts about what can be done, okay, how we can respond to this challenge. Okay? Let's begin with the caveats. We are here tonight to talk about anti-Christian persecution. Now, by no means should that suggest that the suffering of Christians is somehow of higher moral or political value than anyone else's suffering. Okay? Nor should it suggest that Christians are the only group who are being persecuted today, whether defined by religion or any other denominator, whether it is skin color or lifestyle orientation or language or whatever. Okay? There are a variety of groups who are suffering the sting of oppression and marginalization. Christians have no monopoly on suffering, and certainly when Christian blood is shed, that blood is no more valuable than the blood of anyone else. That said, I think there is an argument for a specific focus on anti-Christian persecution for two reasons. One, and we will cover this when we get to the statistical overview, but if we're going to talk about numbers, if we're simply going to talk about raw numbers, it is a fact that Christians today are by far the most persecuted religious group on the face of the planet. So simply in terms of the magnitude of the challenge we're talking about, there is a compelling argument for a kind of preferential option in terms of Christian persecution. Secondly, and perhaps the more important reason why there is a case for a specific focus on the persecution of Christians, is that in the West, that is, I'm talking about the United States, North America, Europe, what we traditionally think of as the West, there is a kind of wall of silence that surrounds the persecution of Christians in a unique way. Because in the West, we are accustomed to thinking of Christianity as the powerful, rich, socially dominant institution in our culture, and it is very difficult for us to get our minds around the idea that Christians can actually be the victims of persecution. If you say violations of religious freedom to the average person who has come of age in either Europe or the United States, what are they going to think of? They're going to think of the wars of religion. They're going to think of the Crusades. They're going to think of the Salem witch trials, all chapters of history in which Christianity, basically speaking, has been the oppressor, not the oppressee. Okay? So there is a kind of psychological block out there to the idea that Christians can be victims of persecution. However, that narrative, and I speak now as a media professional, okay, in the media business, we often survive on narratives long after they have run out of gas in terms of describing contemporary reality, okay? Let's take a look at the contemporary reality of Christianity. There are 2.3 billion Christians in the world today. That is 1/3 of the human population. By the way, 1.2 billion Catholics, meaning we are slightly more than 50% of the global Christian total. Of those 2.3 billion Christians, 3/4 today live outside the West. Okay? They live in Latin America, they live in Africa, they live in Asia, they live in certain parts of the Middle East. They live in the Pacific Islands and Oceania. And in many cases, those are neighborhoods which are not exactly distinguished for their respect for religious freedom. Of those 2.3 billion Christians, 2/3 are poor, and 3/4 are non-white. And so, therefore, the contemporary reality of Christianity is that its zones of greatest growth, its zones of greatest dynamism, are unfolding in places which are also marked often by chronic poverty, by extended conflict, by ethnic and religious hatred. And in those zones where Christians are a minority, they are often exposed to lethal dangers. So my point is that the narrative about Christianity in the West has lost touch with the contemporary reality of Christianity, which creates an impediment to talking about the fact that Christians are just as exposed to persecution, oppression, harassment, as any other minority group, and in fact, given their numbers, they are statistically speaking far more exposed. Okay, so it's not that Christian suffering is somehow worth more than anybody else's. Okay, it is simply that for a variety of reasons, the story of what is happening to Christians in the world today does not get the same traction as, say, contemporary anti-Semitism or other forms of religious or ethnic discrimination. Okay? That's point one. Caveat number two. I am not going to talk tonight very much at all about contemporary religious freedom struggles here in the United States. For example, I am not going to talk about the tug of war over the contraception mandates imposed by the Obama administration as part of health care reform. I am not going to talk about the Kim Davis case in Kentucky and the issues of conscientious objection that raises. And it's not because I don't think those things are important, okay? I do think they're important. I also think they're extraordinarily complex, and it is not a slam dunk always what the right answer to them is. But what I do believe, okay, is that Americans, we have the wrong starting point on religious freedom issues. When we talk about religious freedom, that's the kind of stuff we're talking about most of the time, right? And those things are complicated and they're divisive, and reasonable people of goodwill may draw different conclusions on them, right? Our starting point ought to be, to take one example, the Cathedral of Our Lady of Baghdad, or Our Lady of Salvation in downtown Baghdad, where on October 31st, 2010, a band of 15 armed Islamic gunmen stormed into the cathedral. They shot dead the priest who was saying Mass. It was a Syrian Catholic church. They shot dead the priest who was saying Mass. They shot dead the 2 deacons who were assisting him. They shot dead 53 other people, leaving a total of 56 victims. And they held the church for 4 hours until the Iraqi Defense Forces finally showed up to liberate it. Later on, I interviewed one of the young women who was singing in the choir that day. She is a Syriac Catholic by the name of Fatima. She is now living in Rome. She spends her every waking hour today trying to help her fellow Christians in Iraq get the hell out because she is profoundly convinced that they have no future there. Do you know how she survived? That 4-hour period, you know how she survived? Her choir mate to the right and her choir mate to the left both were shot dead. She fell to the ground, the floor of the church, and she pulled their bodies over her. And she played dead for those agonizing 4 hours as those militants were going around delivering the coup de grace, bullet to the brain of everyone that they could find. That's how she survived. Now, I don't care whether you are a liberal American or a conservative American. I don't care whether you're voting Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump or whatever the political issues here in Boston are. I don't care what they are, okay? I don't think any reasonable person could look at that situation and say that it is anything other than grotesque and terrifying and the worst imaginable possible violation both of basic human rights and also of the right to religious freedom. If we Americans would start our conversation about religious freedom there, then we would understand the values that are at stake here, and I believe that would recalibrate the way we look at our domestic debates. So I'm ignoring those domestic debates tonight, not because I don't think they're irrelevant or important, but simply because I think if we understood what is happening internationally, if we understood the threats to religious freedom that are truly out there, then we would have a better appreciation for the values that we're trying to defend here at home. Okay? All right, that was movement one, okay, the caveats. Movement two, the broad statistical overview. And let me just give you 3 statistics about what's going on in the world today. The first statistic comes from the International Society for Human Rights, which is a secular human rights observatory based in Frankfurt, Germany. So this is not a church outfit. Okay, this is a private, secular human rights watchdog group. According to Martin Lesathan, the former chairman of the International Society for Human Rights, 80%, that's 80% of the violations of religious freedom in the world today are directed against Christians. 80%. Now, that is in part because Christians are simply the world's largest religious community. There are 2.3 billion Christians in the world. There are 1.7 billion Muslims. Together, we make up about 55% of the human population. Because Christians are the largest religious community, they are therefore statistically more exposed to danger. It is also in part, ladies and gentlemen, because Christians, unlike some other religious communities, when faced with violent threats, typically do not respond with violence. Now, there are exceptions. I mean, you can look at the Central African Republic, for example, where there are organized Christian militias doing battle with their Muslim counterparts. The same thing was true in Nigeria during their wars of religion in the 90s. But typically, there are no organized and exceptionally lethal Christian forces out there. So in many parts of the world, Christians are perceived, to be quite honest with you, as a soft target. You can go after Christians, and you don't particularly have to worry about the threat of reprisal. And third, Christians in many parts of the world, quite unjustly and quite inaccurately, are perceived as agents of the West. So, for example, if you are a lower-class, oppressed, victimized minority in Kenya, who is attracted to the Al-Shabaab, which is their version of Al-Qaeda or the Boko Haram or ISIS, okay? And you are angry at the West. You believe that the United States and the other Western powers have systematically conspired to make your life a living hell. What are you going to do? Well, I mean, you could theoretically march down to the American consulate, but, you know, there are concrete barriers in front of that, and it's protected by a battalion of Marine Guards, and it's virtually impossible that you're going to get your way through there to wreak any real damage. You could go to the consulate of the EU, but it is the same thing. It is much easier to simply go down to the street to the neighborhood Catholic Church, which you perceive as part of a Western religion that is part of some kind of imperial conspiracy, okay, and to take out your frustrations there, even though the people in that parish have probably been in this country longer than you have. Their families probably have roots much deeper than yours. They are every bit as much a Kenyan as you are, but nevertheless, because they're part of this particular religion that you perceive to be serving Western interests, it is very tempting to take out your rage against them. Okay? And that is the dynamic that unfolds all across the planet. All right, second statistic. According to the National Center for the Study of Terrorist Threats, which is based in Bethesda, Maryland, which again is not at all a church outfit, it is a government-sponsored think tank that tracks terrorist threats around the world, there has been a 139% increase in terrorist attacks directed at Christians around the world over just the last 3 years. Just the last 3 years, a 139% increase. It is by far the largest jumps in terrorist attacks directed against any specific religious community on the face of the planet. One other statistic, which in my opinion is the most harrowing. Let's talk about the body count. The number of Christians killed every year for reasons related to their faith around the world. The high-end estimate comes to us from the Center for the Study of Global Christianity at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, which is a Protestant organization. There is a scholar there by the name of Tom Johnson who specializes in the quantitative study of Christian martyrdom. He estimates that every year there are 100,000 Christians somewhere in the world killed for reasons related to their faith. 100,000. Now, many experts regard that number as inflated. They think that too much disparate sort of activity is swept into it. The World Council of Churches, which is more, this is not an exact parallel, but it's more or less the Protestant Vatican. I mean, the leading umbrella group for Protestant churches around the world. The World Council of Churches has an expert on these issues, which estimates that the actual number is closer to 8,000, not 100,000. If you're going to have a very strict constructionist view of what being killed for the faith means. I mean, to give you an example of the differences here, Let's say that you've got a Catholic catechist who is in the Congo, okay? And some rebel army sweeps through this section of the Congo and wipes out an entire village, including this catechist. Now, the Center for the Study of Christianity would say, well, that person is a martyr because they chose to put their life on the line to serve people for reasons related to their faith. Okay, the WCC would say, well, no, they're not, because the motives of the executioners had nothing to do with their Christianity, right? Those are the kinds of differences that we get into. But don't get obsessed with the details. Catch the big picture. The big picture is this, okay? Depending on how you count, there is either one Christian killed for reasons related to the faith every 5 minutes of every day or every hour, because that's the difference we're talking about, okay? It's either every 5 minutes or it's every hour. However you count, I would submit to you that that is an epidemic of martyrdom that staggers the imagination. You know, Pope Francis has said repeatedly that there are more martyrs today than in the early centuries of the church. And a lot of time with papal rhetoric, it's very hard to confirm it empirically. Okay? I mean, this is one time when you absolutely can take this to the bank. This is a statistical fact. Okay? That we are living in a historical era that is the greatest, you know, the greatest laboratory, the greatest engine for producing Christian martyrs in the history of the planet. Okay? That is the empirical reality of Christianity in the here and now. I know you probably don't experience it in suburban Boston, and neither do I, but I am telling you, a staggering share of our sisters and brothers in the faith today take their lives in their hands every time they go to church, every time they open their own business, for that matter, every time they walk down the street. Okay, that is the contemporary reality of Christianity today. Now, those are all statistics, and they are compelling, I think, but they don't really lift a veil on the human drama underneath those statistics. So let me just tell you a couple of stories. Last year, my colleague Inez San Martin at Crux Now undertook a major reporting series around the world to try to collect the testimony of contemporary victims of anti-Christian persecution. Let me tell you, I mean, I could tell you dozens of stories. I could tell you hundreds. But let me just tell you two, okay, out of the people we met. In India, by the way, statistically speaking, there are more physical attacks on Christians in India per capita than in any other place in the world today. And it is, by the way, not driven by Muslim radicalism. That's one of the new myths about anti-Christian persecution. We think it is all about Islamic radicalism. Well, listen, I mean, let's not kid ourselves. Islamic radicalism is the world's leading manufacturer of anti-Christian hatred. I mean, that's a fact. But the equally, it is a fact that Islamic radicalism could fall off the face of the earth tomorrow, and that would not mean Christians are safe, because in India, their oppressors and attackers are not Muslims, they're Hindus. It's all about this wave of radical militant Hindu nationalism that has been washing through India in recent years, recent decades. Anyway, the most violent anti-Christian pogrom anywhere in the world in the early 21st century took place in a town, well, in a region of India called Kandhamal. It's in the eastern part of the country in a state called Orissa. This was the summer of 2008. Mobs of Hindu radicals descended upon a series of predominantly Christian villages. They burned 300 churches to the ground. They burned hundreds of Christian schools, social service centers, Christian-owned businesses, private Christian homes. They killed at least 150 people, and we'll never know for sure what the actual body count was, but it was at least 150 people in a period of 3 days. Thousands more were injured. 50,000 were forced to take refuge for 6 months in a nearby jungle where more died of starvation and snakebite. And when I say these people were killed, folks, okay, you have to enter into the experience here to understand the barbarity of it. Because I'm not talking about just, somebody putting a bullet into somebody's brain, which would be heartless enough. Okay. I'm talking about, for example, I interviewed the widow of a Baptist pastor who was captured by one of these mobs. He was dragged into the center of the village square. He was beaten because he refused to renounce his Christianity and to embrace Hinduism, to go through one of these so-called reconversion ceremonies. After they were convinced he was refusing, they dug a pit and they buried him in it up to his neck. For the next 3 days, they threw rocks at him, they kicked him in the head, they urinated on him. At the end of those 3 days, they finally dug him up. They gave him one last chance to renounce his Christianity. When he refused again, they took machetes, they sliced open his stomach, they ripped out his colon, and they wore it around their necks like some kind of bizarre war trophy. And they forced his wife and small children to watch him bleed to death. And this is not an isolated case. That was, in miniature, the story of those days. Absolutely medieval in terms of the level of violence we're talking about. Anyway, one of the people who was caught up in that violence was a Catholic nun by the name of Sister Mina Barwa. She's a Servite nun. Her uncle is actually now the bishop of the diocese where all this happened, Archbishop John Barwa of Cuttack Bhubaneswar. Her name is Sister Mina Barwa. She was working in Kandhamal in a social service center along with a local priest. The mob dragged both of them out of their office. They put a gun to the head of the priest and ordered him to rape Sister Mina. When he refused, they beat him savagely. They actually thought he was dead. That's the only reason they stopped. And it turned out he wasn't quite dead. Miraculously, he recovered, although he's severely injured to this day. Anyway, they proceeded to rape Sister Mina. She actually doesn't know how many times because the attack was so violent she lost consciousness in the middle of it. When she finally came to, they paraded her naked through the village square in a kind of final act of humiliation, and then basically threw her on the side of the road and abandoned her. I think in the conviction that she too would die. She also survived. She has gone on to earn a law degree because she wants to be able to fight for other victims of this kind of thing. When I interviewed her last year, we were in Bhubaneswar, and I asked her, we talked about many things, but I asked her, what spiritual sense do you make of what happened to you? Because obviously you're a prayerful, thoughtful, believing person. So aside from your advocacy and your legal work and all of that, spiritually, how do you process that God could have allowed this to happen to you? Okay. Here was her answer. Her answer was, I have thought and prayed about that at great length. And here's what I have come to. She said, I believe that because Jesus Christ was not a woman, there were certain kinds of suffering he couldn't experience in his own body. And I believe that God gave me the grace to complete the sufferings of Christ on the cross for the salvation of the world. Think about that. Think about that. Second story. We were in Egypt. Now, Egypt, as you know, is an overwhelmingly Muslim nation, but it has a very strong Christian minority. About 10% of the Egyptian population is Christian, largely made up of members of the Coptic Christian Church, which is an Orthodox. There is a Coptic Catholic Church, but it's very, very small. The overwhelming majority is the Coptic Orthodox. They're some of the most stubbornly Christian people on earth. They actually, at birth, every Coptic Christian gets a tattoo of a Coptic cross, a black tattoo of a Coptic cross on their right wrist, so that for the rest of their lives, everywhere they go, everyone will know they are a Christian. Okay, because they know that they are kind of a drop in the bucket in this vast Islamic ocean, but they want to project their identity. That's how proud they are of their Christian roots. We met a doctor. His name is Wadi Ramses. At the time we met him, he was, I think, in his mid-70s. Now, Ramses was born Coptic. You know, he had the tattoo like all the rest of them. But to be really honest with you, he was never all that practicing or, you know, all that into his religion. I mean, he was an accomplished professional, you know, and he had gone out and made a life. And he was a very successful physician. He had a practice in downtown Cairo where the elite of Cairo would come to him. He was a GP, but he was known as being a very, very gifted diagnostician. So if anyone had any kind of vague problem, they would come to him and he would be able to pinpoint it. So, you know, presidents and prime ministers and all of these people would come to him. And at a certain point in his life, Ramses decided he wanted to kind of give something back to the community. So he decided to open, with his own money, he decided to open a charitable clinic out in the hinterlands of Upper Egypt, which, ironically, and this confused the hell out of me when I first got there. Do you know that Upper Egypt is actually below Lower Egypt? It's a very bizarre thing, but it has to do with the flow of the Nile, not geography, okay? So Upper Egypt is in the south, and it's the rural and underdeveloped part of the country. So he decided he wanted to open a clinic there. And being the kind of hands-on professional that he was, you know, he occasionally wanted to go by to do quality control, okay? So one of these days, he's at his charity clinic, and this was right after the Muslim Brotherhood-led government in Egypt had been dislodged in 2013, and there was this kind of tidal wave of Muslim rage flooding through the country. So a band of Islamic militants swept into this village, killing people left and right. And they grabbed Ramses and abducted him. And they put him in a car, and they drove him out into the desert, okay, and threw him into a tent, shackled. And then they took off he had a hood and his mouth was gagged, so they took that off. And they said, "Who are you?" And he said, "You know, I'm Wadi Ramses." "Okay, what do you do?" "Well, I'm a doctor." "Where are you from?" "I'm Cairo." So they put the tape back in his mouth, and then they went off to a corner to debate. And they had seen the cross on his wrist, okay, so they knew he was a Christian, okay? So he's laying there shackled, but they didn't put the hood back on so he can hear, okay? And they proceeded to have a debate for a half hour about whether simply to kill him on the spot and film it, or hold him for ransom, because presumably he came for money, and they could get a payout. Now imagine that being you. You're laying there on the floor of it. You know, there's no realistic hope of rescue. No one knows who you are. Your fate is entirely in the hands of these guys. And you can hear them debating whether to kill you or ransom. Your fate is being decided. I mean, imagine how harrowing and agonizing that had to be. Eventually, they decided to hold him for ransom, so a protracted period of negotiations went on with his family. While those negotiations were going on, every day they would put him in a Jeep, and 4 guys would drive him around the desert. They would recite passages from the Quran to him. They would ask him if he was willing to accept the Quran and renounce Christianity, and when he refused, they would beat him on the back with rubber hoses for days. To this day, only about half of his back is actually covered by skin. He's had several graft operations, but they have not been able to repair the damage. He walks with a very pronounced limp, and he is essentially in constant agony. And this went on for 9 months before a deal was finally made for his ransom. And I asked Wadi, looking back, what do you make of those 9 months? And he told me it was the greatest retreat I could have ever gone on in my life. Because I was stripped of everything. I had no money. I had no power. I had no prestige. All I had was the confidence in my heart that God was with me as I was experiencing that. And I learned to pray in a deep and profound way that no other situation in my life could possibly have given me. I will tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I have been all around the world, and I have interviewed people who have experienced things like that. And you would think that it would have put a dent in their faith, that they would have come to question how a loving God could possibly reward their fidelity with this kind of agony. It is precisely the opposite. What you find is their faith has been strengthened to a degree that is almost unimaginable by our standards. I met a woman in Nigeria who was at a church when it was bombed by Boko Haram on Christmas Day in 2011, who lost 4 of her 5 children and her husband. And I asked her, did you ever, and by the way, she now has a metal plate in her head and can't walk. And I asked her, did this ever cause you to question your faith? You know what her answer was? Those people took everything else I have. I will be damned if they're going to take my faith. And that over and over and over again is what you hear. So those are the stories. What can we do? I would submit to you we can do 3 things. 1, we can pray. Now, obviously, we all believe in the power of prayer, but I don't mean this to be a kind of hollow, pious recommendation. Some of us gathered here tonight are probably old enough to remember the pre-Vatican II Mass, right? Do you remember what we prayed for at the end of every one of those Masses? We prayed for the conversion of Russia. Now, it was a somewhat unecumenical thing to do, of course, because Russia is a profoundly Christian nation and always has been, despite 7 decades of Soviet rule. But what the function of that prayer was to remind us corporately that there was a suffering church behind the Iron Curtain that needed our help. I would submit that if we had organized corporate public prayer today, in every Catholic church, in every Catholic parish, at every Catholic liturgy, on behalf of the suffering and persecuted church around the world, what that would do is it would shape consciousness in the church, and it would produce a kind of Catholic groundswell, the consequences of which, who knows, right? So that's number 1, we can pray, and not just pray privately. Obviously, please do pray privately. I do every night. I will when I get back to the hotel tonight. Believe me, based on the experiences that I have had over the last 10 years, every night when I go to bed, that is the last thing I do, and it's the first thing I do every morning when I get up, is I pray for my suffering sisters and brothers in the faith around the world. So please do that. But beyond that, let us be creative about trying to find opportunities to shape corporate public prayer and worship around the theme of the persecuted church, because there is nothing more powerful in the Catholic Church in terms of shaping our consciousness than the way we worship. You know what the liturgists say? Lex orandi, lex credendi. The law of worship is the law of faith. Well, the law of worship is also the law of thought. What we worship shapes what we think about. And if we are praying for our suffering brothers and sisters, we will also be thinking about them, and we will inevitably act on their behalf. Second, we can try to influence policy. Okay, so this is the level of kind of political activism. And I don't just mean try to make the protection of Christians and other persecuted religious groups a foreign policy priority. That is, expect our candidates to talk about it and so on. Although I do mean that. And by the way, you do not at all have to be Christian to see that as a worthwhile thing to do. Think about it. What zone, let's just talk about the Middle East for a moment. It is the most contested piece of real estate in the world, right? And we all perceive a strategic and foreign policy interest in trying to calm things down there, okay? Now, what is the best way to go about that? Well, do you think that eliminating any vestige of pluralism and religious diversity is going to be helpful? And further, do you think eliminating the one community that has the best connections to the West and functions as a natural bridge between the West and the Islamic world, which is the Christian minority in the Middle East, do you think wiping them out is going to be in our strategic and foreign policy interest? No, on the contrary. We clearly have every strategic and foreign, whether you're a Christian or not, whether you perceive any spiritual value to this or not, we clearly have every strategic and foreign policy interest in the world in trying to support that community, right? But beyond that, I also think we need to bring the voices of these people into our foreign policy calculations. Okay, let me give you a specific example. For the last 3 years, we have been debating, have we not, whether we should or should not try to use force to try to get rid of Assad in Syria, right? Our diagnosis is that he's a thug and a bully, he's a terrible guy, we need to get rid of him, right? Do you know what answer you would get if you asked any Christian in Syria today as to whether that was a good idea? They would tell you, please God, no, because the alternative is much worse. Because for them, it is not a choice between an autocratic police state and a thriving democracy. It is a choice between an autocratic police state and a radical Islamic theocracy. And in that choice, they know which one is better for them and which one is worse. We should be listening to those voices. Okay? And I'm running out of time. So finally, what we can do is we can support those organizations that are already doing yeoman's work to try to bring relief and assistance to our sisters and brothers who are in the firing line. I'm thinking about, in the Middle East, the Catholic Near East Welfare Organization, for example, which is a pontifical organization which has been doing terrific work to bring assistance to Christians in that part of the world for decades. Around the world, I'm thinking about Aid to the Church in Need. That is another Catholic organization of pontifical right whose whole raison d'etre is to support the suffering church, persecuted Christians around the world. We do not have to reinvent the wheel. Okay, there are plenty of good organizations out there to support. The trick is to find them and try to mobilize resources to be of assistance. Okay, final thought. And Father, I'm sorry, I know I'm already over time. Final thought. Why is all this important? Well, for one thing, because we can come to the aid of people who desperately need our help. We could prevent people from needlessly being slaughtered. And these aren't just anybody. Okay, these are our sisters and brothers in the faith. St. Paul once said that the suffering of any part of the body, any place, is the suffering of the entire body. Now, the question we face today is that just pious rhetoric, or do we actually mean it? And if we mean it, then we need to step up. Beyond that, however, I would submit to you, do you know who the real beneficiaries of trying to come to the aid of the martyrs and telling their stories will be? It's not so much the martyrs, it's the rest of us. It's the rest of us. I met a Protestant scholar once by the name of David Barrett, died a few years ago. David was once giving a talk to a group of very high-powered evangelical businessmen in the States. Okay? And David is an expert on Christian mission, right? Evangelization. So these high-powered Christian businessmen, one of them raised their hand and said, Professor Barrett, could you tell us, what does your research suggest? What is the most effective form of Christian mission? And David said, well, based on all of our research, I would say the most effective form of Christian mission, that is the single thing that brings more people to the faith than anything else, most successful form of Christian mission is martyrdom. And these businessmen paused a beat, and then another one raised his hand and said, Professor Barrett, could you tell us what the second most effective? So obviously we don't lust after martyrdom, but folks, it's true. The stories of the martyrs are the best missionary calling card we've got. Okay? I'll tell you one last story. Sister Elena Scoberti. So Sister Elena was an Italian Salesian missionary. She was based in Mogadishu in Somalia in 2006. Now, in 2006, there was a huge wave of instability and violence and Islamic radicalism going on. Every other Western institution had bugged out of the city. All the embassies, all the media organizations, all the reporters, all the NGOs, everyone had left. She was the last Westerner left in Mogadishu. Okay? But she had brought a group of Kenyan nuns to a hospital that the Salesians were running, and she didn't want to abandon them, and she didn't want to abandon the people that they were serving, overwhelmingly Muslim, by the way. Her best friend in Mogadishu, her driver, her bodyguard, her best friend, was a Muslim man, father of 4. One day at the clinic, they all knew this day would come. One day at the clinic, the radicals rolled into the compound and they were mowing people down. Her Muslim friend, this father of 4, tried to shield Sister Elena's body with his own. He took the first bullet. She took the next 4. They died together on the hospital floor, their blood mingling. Her last words as she died in Italian were perdono, perdono, which basically means I forgive, I forgive. If that isn't the Christian spirit in miniature, if that isn't the best of who we are, I'm not sure I've ever seen it. I mean, you know how I got into this at the very beginning, covering anti-Christian persecution? I was in Ukraine, and a young woman told me the story of her grandfather who had been executed under the Soviets for his fidelity to the church. Folks, I grew up in rural western Kansas in the 1970s and 80s, okay? My idea of suffering for the faith was eating fish sticks and mac and cheese on Fridays during Lent, okay? That was my concept of carrying the cross, okay? I had no idea, okay? What hearing stories like that over and over and over again has brought home to me is that beyond all of the politics and the scandal and the heartache about the church, all of those things that all of us know, and it's not that they're unreal, they're very real, and we all know them chapter and verse, okay? But beyond all of that, there is something so precious about this faith that ordinary people, when push comes to shove, will pay in blood rather than let it go. And if that doesn't light your missionary and evangelical fires, I'm not sure what would. So we need to raise consciousness. We need to tell the stories of the martyrs. For them, certainly, but also for us. Those of us whose faith is often in danger of running out of gas, we are struggling with ennui and angst and sturm and drang, and we think the real challenges of the Christian life are parish closers and financial scandals. No, folks. There are people around the world who are putting much more on the line on a daily basis than that, and we need their witness, and we need their example to recharge our batteries. In other words, the ultimate beneficiaries of this crusade are not simply those in the firing line. It's the rest of us behind the firing line who can finally appreciate what real faith and real fidelity looks like. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me leave you with this thought. Please join me in telling the stories of our martyrs today. Join me in supporting and defending today's martyrs because they need our help, but even more than that, because we need their witness and their example. Thank you. God bless you. God bless the Seminary of John the 23rd. Yeah, but I know I ran over. Thank you. Okay, one of the benefits of being a rector is that you have the ability to set aside a formal program anytime you feel like it. So I know we were supposed to finish at 8:30, but Father has said if we want to take 10 minutes, if there are a couple of burning questions before we go to the reception. I will also be at the reception, so if you just want to talk informally, we can certainly do that. But if there are a couple things right now for the group, yes.
Yes, Father Mark Gavin, faculty here. The stories that you have come across since you wrote your book,
Yeah.
Are they compiled somewhere?
So the question is, I did a book called The Global War on Christians, which came out in 2012. Believe it or not, it was pre-ISIS. That was a pre-ISIS world back then. And I will say this, when I brought the book out, when I would do TV, the form of denial that was regnant then, the question I would get is, what do you mean anti-Christian persecution? Right? You had to wade through that sort of psychological block. I was saying, the whole idea that such a thing could be possible. Today, the new form of denial is that there's any form of anti-Christian persecution other than ISIS. right? I mean, people are willing to grant ISIS, but the list kind of stops there. Anyway, to answer your question, are the stories I've done since the book compiled any place? They are on the Crux site. So if you come, Crux is a news outlet that covers the Catholic Church. It's an online resource. You can find us at www.cruxnow.com. And if you go on Crux, we have an entire page devoted to the stories of the new martyrs. So all you got to do is type that into our search engine. And so for example, the story of Wadi Ramses, the story of Mina Barwal, all of that is there. I mean, unfortunately, of course, the last line of the gospel, that there are, if all the books of the world would not be enough to accommodate the stories of the Savior, right? Well, it's the same thing with the new martyrs. I mean, we could do nothing but that and still just scratch the surface. I mean, if you're talking about, even if we take the low-end estimate, you're talking about 8,000 stories of new martyrs every year. I mean, that's one of the problems. So much of this, unfolds under the cover of darkness, right? And what I think is that we need an observatory. I mean, basically what we need is a Christian Yad Vashem. We need the equivalent of Yad Vashem that has a living memory project where, people would be deployed full-time to go around and collect the stories of survivors and family members. Because otherwise, all of this is going to be lost to history. And there are a lot of, and it's not just the logistics of it, it's often that, people who suffer this kind of thing can be hesitant to talk about it. I remember when John Paul went to, it was Croatia. I think this was 2002. I was on that trip. Okay, and believe it or not, I was on the papal plane, but somehow I got separated from the papal party because we went to Trnava. So no, this was Slovakia, not Croatia, right? Slovakia. So I was in Trnava. And I got separated from the papal party, and I'm walking around downtown Trnava in a panic because, the papal party doesn't stop for anyone, right? I mean, you're either there or you're not. So, what I was worried about was I was just going to get abandoned, and all of a sudden I'm in Trnava, and how the hell do I get back to Rome? And I wandered up to the Jesuit parish, in downtown Trnava, just basically knocked on the door and flashed my Vatican credential, hoping that would get me some love. And they took me in, and it turned out there was a Jesuit there an old guy who had been arrested in the Soviet era, and shipped off to the gulags. And both his legs had been broken, and he still couldn't walk right, and, his hand was screwed up because of what they had done to him and all of that. And they were telling me this guy is just absolutely loved by all the young people in this parish. He's confirmed them. He's just, one of these beloved guys, right? Everybody likes him. And while I was waiting for the bus that was going to swing by and pick me up, I asked a couple of these young people, so has Father told you what happened to him in the gulag? They had no idea. No clue. He had never talked about it. They had never asked. Because there was this kind of social compact in the post-Soviet era that if we start that kind of finger-pointing, society is going to unravel. So we just have agreed not to talk about it. Which meant, of course, that his testimony, would be completely lost. Right? So I really do believe that we need some kind of organized initiative in the Christian world, to go around and try to collect these testimonies before they just perish, and simply because there's such a staggering volume of them that you kind of need an initiative like that to keep up. Yes, Father?
Hi, Emmett Murphy, Franciscan Friar. I want to thank you for a very beautiful talk and very enlightening.
OFM?
OFM.
So not an OFM cap?
No, we're the originals.
Okay, so you're not kind, you're not quite the flavor of the month in this archdiocese, but okay, you're moving in the same neighborhood. So you're claiming the Capuchins and the Third Orders have no right to that nomenclature whatsoever? What is this, some kind of franchising thing? All right. Sorry.
Anyway, I spent time in the custody of the Holy Land, and I saw kind of a bloodless started, and with the friars working with
Sure.
with the Arab people there, they were so oppressed.
Sure.
Wonderful. Can you elaborate on that a little bit if you could?
Sure. Well, first of all, let me say I am an enormous admirer of Pizzaballa. I just think he's one of the, in 25 years of covering the Catholic Church, he's one of the most impressive men I've ever met. Pier Battista Pizzaballa is the new apostolic delegate running the Latin Patriarchate of Jerusalem. Bergoglio actually wanted to make him patriarch, but he said no, he would prefer to be apostolic delegate. But anyway, so to your broader point about the situation facing Christians in the Holy Land, yeah, I mean, the problem, Israel has, as you know, a fairly powerful propaganda machine. And Israel will always say, and every time I've been on a papal trip to Israel, they will always say, and in a certain way it's true, they will say that Christians have it better in Israel than virtually any place else in the Middle East. And there is a degree to which that's true. Now, it's not true of Jordan. It's not true of Lebanon. I mean, you can find counterexamples, but it certainly sure as hell is better than Syria or Iraq or, a lot of these places. And what they mean by Christians have it better is that, A, they're not being killed. And in general, that's true. I mean, there is very little lethal violence against Christians in areas under Israeli control. Okay. Now, it's also true, by the way, in areas under Palestinian control. Okay. And the other thing they mean is that the Christian community is growing in Israel. Well, that's also true. But the reason the Christian community is growing in Israel is not native growth of the Arab Christian population. They're actually trying to get the hell out for the most part. The reason it's growing is because it's being swelled by a lot of Orthodox Christians from the former Soviet bloc who have Jewish ancestry somewhere and can therefore produce the paperwork in order to be able to get into Israel, right? Plus, you also have a huge expat community. You know what the most rapidly growing Christian community in Israel is? It's Filipino guest workers, okay? And so, but I mean, all of that is true, okay? There is a basic sense in which Christianity is free to operate in Israel. What most Arab Christians will tell you, however, is they perceive themselves very much as second-class citizens. But it's not primarily because they're Christians. It's primarily because they're Arabs, right? And they suffer the same hardships as the rest of the Arab minority in Israel, which is now, of course, you should know, on its way to becoming an Arab majority, right? And further, I mean, it is true that Israel has imposed a whole series of security measures that have made life very difficult for the Christian population there. For example, it is virtually impossible if you are an Arab Christian and you live in Ramallah, okay, or Bethlehem, right, and you want to get to East Jerusalem for Easter, forget about it. I mean, and by the way, I'm talking about covering basically 3 miles. Okay, I mean, it's not a huge stretch of territory, but to get the permits you need to cross the various checkpoints, I mean, it's tough for us. Okay, I went through, the last time I was there, I went through as a member of the papal party, okay, and it still took us an hour and a half to negotiate these checkpoints, and it was really tough. I mean, imagine being just a typical Joe Blow Arab Christian, right, and therefore, they don't really care about the Christian part. The Arab thing is what they see, right? Trying to navigate that, it is extremely difficult. And in general, my read would be, to be real honest with you, because parallel to all of this, of course, as you probably know, Israel and the Vatican have been involved in negotiations for a long time about trying to implement their 1993 fundamental agreement. And Israel has been dragging its heels. What I think my read would be that Israel is rhetorically committed to the welfare of its Christian population because they believe that plays well in the West. Practically, they just don't give a damn. So there is no overt, lethal hostility. What there really is a slow-motion death spiral that they are just content to allow play out. That would be my read.
I just want to say, years ago, this was our passport to go from one country to the other.
And you could pass with that, sure. Yeah. Well, it's a whole different world. I mean, in the old days, security used to serve the state. In Israel today, the state serves security. That's what it is. And by the way, it's not like life is a picnic for the Christian minority in the Palestinian territories either. Let's be clear. Now, on the West Bank, things are fairly stable. You know, Abbas and his regime are fairly committed because they also perceive rhetorical value to having a minority group there. But beyond that, I mean, Christians play important roles in the government in the West Bank and so on. On the Gaza Strip, it's a somewhat different situation. You know, the Gaza Strip is under Hamas control, and it depends on the day. But, you know, the one Christian bookstore there got firebombed a few years ago. You know, Christians there suffered various kinds of harassment. And first of all, it's a tiny Christian community anyway. But they suffered various kinds of persecution. So I'm not trying to take sides here. All I'm saying is that in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, both sides like to use their Christian minority for rhetorical purposes, and I'm not really convinced either side is actually committed to their welfare. Is that it? Yes? Sure.
And see whether or not we get some perspective from what you've told us. You said very nice things about Boston. There's a lot of people here from Connecticut who didn't mention New Haven. And you had a journey from Boston to New Haven, like Crux Now from the Globe and the Knights of Columbus in terms of sponsorship.
They're not our only sponsor, but yes.
And along that road, there are different perspectives. Some people would say it seems like you went from NCR to NCR, National Catholic Reporter to National Catholic Register. And the problem that is, for instance, in this country especially, we describe the positions along that road in political terms, in the poisonous political terms of conservative and liberal. Is there a hermeneutic or a language for the people of God to describe those positions differently, especially in the perspective of what you told us tonight?
Well, I mean, first of all, as far as I and Crux are concerned, I have never in my career believed that my perspective is being driven by whoever happens to be paying my salary. I mean, I believe that they are paying me because they like my perspective, not because they want me to craft my perspective on the basis of the salary. Okay? So I don't think there's anything different about what we're doing today than we would have done when we were under the aegis of the Boston Globe or whatever. Right? But I take because your broader point is, how do we talk about those differences in ways that is neither naive, right, like ignoring the reality that's in front of us, but at the same time also not like unhelpful, right? Look, I fall back on that old dictum from Thomas Aquinas, right? You know, Aquinas famously said that grace builds on nature, it doesn't cancel it out, it doesn't eliminate it, right? So the fact that there is a political dimension to ecclesiastical reality does not deny that there's also something more than that, but it also doesn't make that political dimension unreal, right? I mean, so, for example, if we want to talk about the difference between, say, the National Catholic Reporter and the Knights of Columbus, I think you'd have to be more than blind, you know, not to acknowledge there's a clear political difference there. And conventionally, the words we would use for that would be the Reporter is more liberal and the Knights are more conservative, right? Now, this gets a little bit tricky. I mean, conservative, okay, that one I think works good. Liberal is a little confusing because we have to be clear, are we talking about Catholic liberal or secular liberal, right? Because a Catholic liberal might say, yeah, I'm okay with communion for the divorced or remarried. You know, I believe we ought to promote the role of women in the church. I believe that we should have decentralization and collegiality. Doesn't necessarily mean they're pro-abortion, pro-gay marriage, you know, all of the stuff that secular liberal means, right? But if we're going to grant Catholic standards, clearly there is a contrast between liberal and conservative in the church. Okay, it's a plain fact, and anybody with eyes can see it. Okay, I've lived it in my own career. Okay, and I don't think we have to be threatened by that, right? Why should we? I mean, that's what preserves us. What's what keeps us a church rather than a sect, right? That, you know, we embrace diversity rather than get terrified by it, right? Yes. So, however, I think we have to be able to project beyond them, right? Because the problem is the way those terms are used in contemporary American discourse, they are instruments of polarization and division, right? And so we have to, listen, I have no problem with saying there's a liberal and conservative in the church, as long as that's not the fundamental thing, as long as whoever is carrying those labels, okay, would see being part of the family as more fundamental than whatever their particular position might be, right? And I have said that, what we really need in the Catholic Church in this country is that we need, in that sense, we need a grassroots campaign to rebuild zones of friendship across the party lines. Because here's the thing that's happened in America, and this isn't just a Catholic problem, this is a broad American problem. You want to read a great book about American sociology? Okay, let me give you your reading recommendation for the night, all right? Go home and on Amazon or whatever, or however you acquire your literature, look up the book called The Big Sort, S-O-R-T, The Big Sort. It's by a guy by the name of Bill Bishop. Bill's a friend of mine. It was written in 2004, but the fundamental realities are still the same. Bill was, in 2004, he was a political reporter for the Austin Journal-Statesman in Texas. Okay? So he was covering the 2004 campaign, right? And of course, as we all know, in 2004, Texas was the reddest of the red states, right? Since the dawn of time, since the first gases coalesced after the Big Bang, it was written into the fabric of the universe that Texas would go for George Bush in 2004, right? Bill's question was, why the hell don't I know that from the little liberal enclave I live in Austin, Texas, okay? Which was the ultimate in Prius-driving, whale-saving, Birkenstock-wearing, granola-crutching liberal chic, right? And so Bill started doing all this sociological research, and what he found is that the dominant trend in American sociology over the last 35 years is that increasingly Americans work, worship, live, and recreate only with people who think like themselves. We have become a nation of gated communities of both the physical and the virtual sort. Okay? Money bit of data from that book was he compared the 1968 and 2004 elections, and they were actually eerily similar, okay? 68 was Nixon-Humphrey, 2004 was Bush-Kerry, so you had the kind of Republican faith in, law and order in the case of Nixon, faith and values in the case of Bush, versus the more kind of effete, secular whatever thing that was on offer. In both cases, the Republican won a narrow victory, but the difference was this. In 1968, 75% of Nixon voters said they had a close personal friend who voted for Humphrey. In 2004, only 35% of Bush voters said they had a close personal friend who voted for Kerry. So it's not that we were more divided. The difference is that in the intervening period of time, we have become strangers to one another. And it is, of course, much easier to demonize a stranger than a friend, right? So that's the problem with these labels. It's not that they don't capture something real, right? But in a context in which we just don't know each other anymore, they can so easily become kind of wedge labels that drive us even further apart, right? So what we've got to do is rebuild these zones of friendship, and it affects the church as much as it does in any other institution in the culture. We've got to rebuild these zones of friendship in which people who don't naturally rub shoulders with one another anymore start to. Because can I give you my big discovery, 25 years of covering the Catholic Church? I have gotten to know on a personal basis, both at the top and the bottom of the church. Okay, lots of people who would fit the stereotype of a liberal, and lots of people who would fit the stereotype of a conservative, lots of people who would fit the stereotype of a moderate, and every point of the compass in between. And in the Catholic Church I live in, we would be impoverished without any of them. Okay, because I see in all of them, I don't necessarily agree with everything, but I see the human good because they have become friends, right? And that's what we got to do. We got to build those spaces in which those labels no longer drive us apart, right? But we learn to recognize them as part of the enriching diversity, the menagerie, that is Catholicism. right? It doesn't mean we don't stand for anything. The church has to stand for stuff. But within that, we have the capacity to absorb and embrace tremendous diversity, right? Just we haven't done such a good job of it lately, and that's what we have to get back to. I presume that's the end. So wait, before you turn off my microphone, one last thing I want to say. I want this to be the beginning of our kind of conversation rather than the end, okay? So I don't want to just parachute out of here and have no further contact. So let me make this offer. If there is ever any way I can be of help to someone in this room, or in this chapel, I don't really know what that would be, but if you here at the seminary, if you're in a class and you feel the need for some Vatican rumor control, or you're in an adult faith study group someplace and some question comes up you think I could help with, or I mean, for God's sake, if you're coming to Rome and you want restaurant recommendations, okay? And yes, I know it is a real burden of my office that so much of my work is done over heavy Italian lunches and dinners, but I want you to know I am over there carrying the cross for all of you. Okay? Whatever it is, okay, if you go onto the Crux site, again, www.cruxnow.com, almost every day there's an article by me up there. Today I have a profile on the Pope's new cardinal from Papua New Guinea. A Capuchin mission, by the way, not the OFMs, the OFM Caps, out there being the Marines of the Catholic Church. Anyway, at all of those articles, my email address is at the bottom, and I do use that. Now, if you're going to do that, please put, the St. John the 23rd Seminary or something in the subject line. So I don't think you're the 9th Nigerian prince today who's going to give me $30 million. But, assuming you permeate my spam filter, if I can be of help to you, I would be delighted to do that. Thank you. God bless you. God bless the St. John the 23rd Seminary. God bless the Archdiocese of Boston.
Very nice.
Thanks.
Are you going to say something?
Huh?
You're going to say something.
Yeah. You have booze, right?